All right, I will get us started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It is a pleasure to be with you for the second session of the Global Urban Network seminar series. My name is Professor Matti Simiatycki. I'm the interim director of the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. Over the last 2 years now, we've convened this Global Urban Network to bring scholars together from around the world to talk about shared challenges to do with cities and to identify areas of collaboration and places where we can work together more deeply to address some of the major issues that cities face. Today's session is no different, focusing on urban neighborhoods. And we've brought together some of the leading experts within our network and globally to talk about issues related to neighborhoods. Today's session is being moderated by Professor Karen Chapple. Karen is a professor and chair of city and regional planning at the University of Berkeley currently. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the group as Karen will be taking up the lead of the School of Cities as its director starting in July. This is both an opportunity to share amongst our group and also to introduce Karen to this network. So welcome, Karen. And with that, I will turn over the floor to you. Thanks, everyone. I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Matti, and thanks to Lara and the School of Cities for helping to launch this marvelous network. I should note that I'm sitting today in Berkeley, California, and we're on the territory of the Huich and the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. And it's a great pleasure to be sitting on this land here before sunrise to set the scene for this discussion about neighborhoods. As Matti mentioned, it's this network that gives us this opportunity to share and compare our own urban experiences so that we can advance knowledge and urban science and build our own urban community, our sense that we are all in it together at the same time. So just a moment to speak about neighborhoods. Since the pandemic began, we've all developed a closer relationship to our own neighborhoods. It reminds me of when I was about to have a child. Actually, my mentor, Professor Ann Markison, said to me, "Your entire world is about to become very, very small." And she was right. You don't understand that until you do it. And now we've all gone through the pandemic together, so we all know about that intimacy of living in a shrinking world. So it's interesting today to delve into studying urban development and community at the scale of the neighborhood and to think together about how that can help us not just envision, but create the more sustainable cities of the future. As academics, we have some ideas about how we could imagine future sustainable cities. We take knowledge about how communities work, we combine it with knowledge about how people make decisions, and then we look at how efficiently and equitably the networks and systems that connect us work. But as urban residents, as neighbors, we can just look with our own eyes based on our own experiences. And that gives us not only an interesting scientific framework with which to envision the future, but also a political foundation, because we can use data and concepts that feel very real and meaningful to people, and that people can even create themselves. So what you're going to hear today is three people who have all thought a tremendous amount about what it is about neighborhoods and the people that make neighborhoods that actually makes it possible to envision a more sustainable planet. I particularly like that this panel today is so interdisciplinary. We're going to hear today from a political scientist, a planner, and a physicist. So to some logistics. We're going to have a presentation from each speaker for about 10 minutes each. The rest of the time will be reserved for Q&A. The protocol today is we want you to be as interactive as possible. So please do ask questions. We'll have a session for question and answers after the 3 talks. And you can start using the chat anytime at the bottom of the screen. When you use the chat, please include your name and your affiliation so we know who's speaking. When we get to the Q&A session, you can ask questions using the raise your hand button if you prefer. But if you think of things while our speakers are talking, please do put them in the chat box because we'd like to follow up with a great discussion after the presentations. If you wish to enable or disable the closed captioning feature, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. The captions are only in English, unfortunately. If you're posting about today's event on Twitter or LinkedIn, please use the hashtag Urban2021. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Maarten Hajer is a distinguished professor of urban futures and director of the Urban Futures Studio at Utrecht University. He holds degrees in political science and urban and regional planning with a doctorate from Oxford, and he's an international leader in the area of sustainability. He'll be speaking today about his recent book, Neighbourhoods for the Future. This is a much needed contribution to the literature because it makes the case that the neighborhood is the appropriate scale to build our urban futures. As he says, it's small enough to be tangible, large enough to make a difference. He asks us to build the post-fossil city through the imaginary of neighborhoods. Can I invite you to give your remarks, Maarten? Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and hello to you all, wherever you are. Indeed, in the introduction you just gave, Karen, you gave away the punchline, I suppose, of this this book that I did with a couple of colleagues from Utrecht. And the book really is a response to a report that I did earlier for the International Resource Panel. In that report, we calculated the resource requirements of future urbanization, so the 2050 prediction, which suggests that 40% of the urban fabric still is to be installed. And if we basically do that in the same way that we've been building our cities over the last 100 years, we're done. We can forget about the 1.5 or 2 degree climate targets because of concrete and cement and the like. But that sort of UN negativism be combined with a much more positive idea. I'm trying to get to the next slide. It seems to be stuck. Okay, which is actually was done by a mathematician, Serge Salat from Paris, who was also part of the research group. And he says, well, if you combine all the things that you need to do to get to a sustainable city, it multiplies actually its effect. So good urban planning, changing the layout of cities and so forth, allows indeed for future cities to be built with much less resource requirements. Now, that sort of figure is the background figure for what we do in this book. And the jump from the planetary to the neighborhood, I think, is crucial also politically, because that is where actually people live their lives and also where they actually have expertise that should be brought into the discussion. And on a planetary scale, that's much less the case. In the Netherlands, we are, I suppose, just like in your countries, we are now experiencing what implementation means. And implementation means people waking up to what is going on and what is happening, like insulating neighborhoods. And it leads to big protests. And that's not so surprising if you think that we not only have to rethink energy resources, we also have to rethink mobility, we have to rethink shelter, and we have to rethink food. So all these things that people are very much accustomed to and love are now to be debated if we want to create that post-fossil city. And if that's not enough, can't focus technocratically on a green future. We also have to make sure that it's just. So in that space, as we thought it was important to just make an inventory first of neighborhoods that try and do precisely that and see how far they got, and also to allow comparing notes between these neighborhoods. And I should immediately add that the cases that we listed in the book, in the end, were the cases from basically OECD countries. So while the message of neighborhoods as a sort of planning approach to sustainable futures also holds true, I think, very much for the Global South, this book has case studies from the Global North. That it is worth looking into that is, I mean, this is basically the now iconic comparison between Barcelona and Atlanta, I suppose, where you see what suburbanization does to your CO2 footprint. It's 10-fold CO2 footprint just because of the mobility requirements. And Barcelona, I suppose, is for many now also a sort of an example of how you could think about future cities. Now, Barcelona has in the CERDA grid about 22,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, and that's not necessarily what we need with the UN calculations that I presented earlier. It's about 11,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. That would also, if you would use that as a target, you would also get a long way. But then we're talking about neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods are indeed small enough to be tangible, but big enough to make a difference. You can't think, the climate politics on the level of a singular home. You have to think about scale. And neighborhoods are, of course, also where you could rethink what it means to live in a city where you don't need to move around that much. Charles Marino, who is now famous for his 15-minute city, I suppose, is thinking along similar lines. But we try to look at it through the lens of existing neighborhoods that have achieved significant improvements in sustainability. Hunzinger Areal is an example in Zurich. They took the 2000 watt idea of a socially just division of energy per person globally as the starting point of what the neighborhood would then look like. And it looks like this. So very much unlike people think that if you really become serious, it looks nasty. It doesn't look nasty at all, but it makes choices. There are no cars in this neighborhood at all, apart from for nurses and people who have disabilities. They still use concrete, but they use much more collective spaces and fewer square meters per private space. For the Torontonians, Regent Park, I think, is also a very interesting case, and it is interesting for a different reason. It is interesting for the fact that it allowed to improve the social mix and at the same time give people a right of return, which often doesn't work. So if you rebuild a neighborhood, often it drives poor residents out. In this case, there was a right of return, and it was basically paid for by adding a third of the building stock in private condominiums, and that allowed for a neighborhood that is remarkably well-positioned and remarkably popular after being a neighborhood that was crime-ridden and deeply unpopular. Now, analytically, we argued this is about neighborhood ecologies. The component parts, the services, the nodes for exchange, but also the material infrastructures like supermarkets, postal offices, and what have you, that in their interaction make a neighborhood into a good neighborhood. And to people in an academic setting, that may come as a surprise, because we're all urbanists in a way, but that in their interaction is something that empirically goes wrong quite a bit. And our feeling is that if we see who's pushing for sustainability in neighborhoods at the moment, they lose the social urbanist perspective, and that is what this book tries to bring back into the equation. What you then get is very alternative sort of neighborhoods that are very pleasant to live in. Vauban, in the book, we narrate because it actually can be explained for its quality by the fact that it allowed for groups of citizens to act as a developer. And such very simple rules explain the fabric and also the social interaction and the neighborhood ecology that emerges. And that relationship between the images and, say, the performance indicators and that work on the institutional rule systems is something that this book tries to bring to the fore. Bo 01 in Malmö is another case where you see a neighborhood that is truly remarkable for the way in which they integrated water management in the neighborhood and also brought social equality and social mix to a new area in the midst of the city. Analytically, apart from that concept of neighborhood ecology, we say, let's look at these neighborhoods with this other concept, what we call the neighborhood arrangement. So our explanation for quality is always a combination of a set of ideas, actors with a sense of ownership, resources that make it possible for neighborhoods that do well to keep that money in the neighborhood, and what we call a neighborhood value chain, so that gentrification doesn't lead to money going elsewhere, but that is reinvested in the neighborhood itself. And the rules are that what explains at some point that people can actually create that deeper quality also financially. So the conclusion of our study of what initially were 100 projects, but in the end are 12 projects that we look as vignettes, and then 3 we look at in depth, is that a radical socialism is possible, but depends on actors with skin in the game that have at least a 30-year perspective on the quality of a neighborhood, on rules that keep created value within the neighborhood, and on a strong shared public domain of functions that are of interest to anybody in that neighborhood, and always brought together by a carefully attended and circulating storyline. And this is the type of neighborhoods that fit then that global perspective of a future of neighborhoods. GWL in Amsterdam, where you see no cars and the neighborhoods at all, they're all parked on the side, on the industrial sides of the plot. So in this really brief presentation, I suggested that planning is not at all to be about accommodating, but it is also very much about shaping aspirations. We have this concept of the imaginary, and I think we do far too little with that in sustainability research. The idea that sustainability is not about taking away qualities from people, but actually about creating better urban qualities that also can function as an aspiration for people to move towards. And then in this book, we say, well, it is not about big imaginaries like the functionalist city of Le Corbusier. It is about a modest imaginary of comparing notes, looking at what others have done to create better neighborhoods, and then seeing where you get with that imaginary, but very much with the idea that it is not about the existing neighborhoods and insulating them alone, but it is very much about how to densify our suburbs to create that sort of meaningful interaction that belongs to the urbanist philosophy, also for a suburban environment. And there is a lot to be gained. So to conclude, in this book, we try to say, and we bring to the discussion the idea that urbanists thought that for 100 years we've sort of exercised in the academic circles should be connected very much to the heart of addressing climate change. Let's not move to a climate change sort of politics like we moved to a smart city politics, disconnected from that literature of urbanism. And if we bring that social ecology together with that sustainable ecology, we think neighborhoods are a cornerstone of a working strategy to cope with climate change and make sure we don't ruin our societies in the 21st century. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Maarten, for setting the stage for us so wonderfully. Next, we're going to go to Mee Kam Ng. She's Vice Chair of the Department of Geography and Resource Management, Director of the Urban Studies Program, and Associate Director of the Institute of Future Cities at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her background is in planning, and her PhD is from UCLA. She's an active member of the Royal Town Planning Institute, a fellow of the Hong Kong Institute of Planners, and academic advisor of the Hong Kong Institute of Urban Design, among many other honors. Professor Ng is dedicated to deconstructing the growth at all costs mentality, the economic growth first mentality. She has a deep and abiding interest in making places that also make people, places that respect both nature and human dignity and promote psychological and social well-being. Mee Kam, welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your kind introduction. So let me share my PowerPoint. Okay, all right. So I thanks so much, Maarten, for your very enlightening opening speech. And my speech will focus more into sort of like the challenges of really doing sustainable development at the district level. Let me sort of like talk about, oh, I have a problem now, okay. Okay, so just in case you don't know where Hong Kong is, this is Hong Kong. Just give you some idea about Hong Kong if you've not been to the city. It's a city of 7.5 million people, over 1,111 square kilometers. Only a quarter of the land is being developed. And that has given rise to sort of like a very interesting landscape. One very important thing is that if you really look at the distribution of the population, which has to do with Hong Kong's colonial past, that most of the population actually lived in the main urban areas, which used to be the ceded territory to UK. So 90% of the population actually lived in 24% of the land, whereas only 10% lived in the rest of the 3/4 of the land. And that has given rise to all sorts of landscape in our city, from very dense old urban areas to public housing estates to this kind of transitional zones where you've got brownfield sites, you've got old villages with some interesting buildings surrounding it, or like you can have fields, but then you can also see the high rises. So it's actually, when we think about neighborhood, we're talking about different kinds of neighborhoods, in a sense. So our institute was asked by this district. This is called Chuman District. You can see it's right here. It's actually not in the densest part of the city already. And you can see that there are some green area, lower density. And even in sort of like in this area, in terms of population, is about, a 1/3 about 4.3% of the territorial total. And the area is about 61 square kilometers, about 5.5%. So it's one of the first new towns in Hong Kong. It was first developed as an industrial city. But however, because of China's opening up, it's been restructuring spatially and also socioeconomically. This new town has been built, over the years through reclamation of land from the sea. And you can see that, phase 1, that part was reclaimed for industrial use. And also a sizable part of number 2 is also for industrial use. But over the years, as we said, there's been restructuring, and that has constituted to issues. And in recent years, there are further reclamation, which constitutes newer developments. So when we think about neighborhoods, even in one district in our city, you can see that you've got this very complex kind of, situation that on the eastern side, most of them are more like public housing estates. But the central part, the original sort of like new town, you've got these 2 industrial areas. which kind of like have interface with a city center, which has been old. And you can see that there's been, industrial buildings, but right next to it, you've got all these residential buildings creating all sorts of problems in the development process. Or like you see these old buildings, but with, gentrified estates right next to it. So that's the situation in the central areas. Whereas on the western side, capitalizing on great sea view, we've got more private housing, more luxurious housing by Hong Kong standard. So that's the spatial situation of just one district in the whole city. So they asked us to carry out a carrying capacity for them because they face a lot of problems, especially in the city center, which has its own problems, with the expansion of the whole district. They have to also serve the needs of the people there. So we try to reveal the environmental impact, the natural resources, infrastructure, community services, institutional and social carrying capacity. According to the framework, we should also look into public perception, but because of time constraint and also COVID-19, we could not afford to really do that. So you can see that actually this district is quite blessed because it's actually very close to a mountain with great natural resources, and given its history, there's a lot of cultural heritage in this district as well. However, Maarten mentioned about climate crisis, right? So according to some of the studies, we can see that because of the reclamation is so close to the sea, it's an estimate that 1/3 of the population in this district is actually facing sea level rise. And because of the sequence of development and the spatial planning processes, we can see very uneven distribution of open spaces and particularly high shortage, especially in the city center. As a result of this interface problems and restructuring processes in the city center. The same for a lot of the drainage issues, pollutions, it again, focusing on the city center. The noise pollution along major roads, you can see that's pretty serious in this district as well. However, as old districts in Hong Kong, transportation network has been very convenient, as you can see, with railways, with highways, with network of flyovers, pedestrian walkways, etc. However, as you can see here, we also look into the pedestrian services, and the level of pedestrian services not that great in the city center. Again, the level of services have been pretty low as a result of very dense population. I don't have time to really report to you the details, but you can see a lot of crosses in this table, which summarizes, the review of the natural resources. Similarly, for community facilities, we can see that there's problem with the distribution, the quality of recreational facilities, medical services, and secondary school classrooms, etc. We also look into the institutional carrying capacity. This district compared to the territorial average is actually not too bad, except a few things. One is, old age poverty issues. According to the figures that we gathered, 1/3 of the old age people, they can be classified as poor. And if you remember, we talk about the East public housing and the West is like private housing, and the city center has a lot of issues with gentrification and also old buildings, which are sort of like divided into what we call subdivided units. So you do have, redevelopment issues as well. So the city center is really probably the area with, a lot of issues that this district has to handle. So these subdivided units actually have a very tiny units, but then they charge also pretty high rental. So the social carrying capacity also, because of sort of private housing, people moving in. So in terms of education, working, or even production, you see this restructuring from manufacturing to more commercial office retailing activities. The only issue is that in the administration sort of like regime in Hong Kong is that if you still remember, this district actually occupy about like 4 or 5% of the population and land area. But if you really look into the district council is actually not a political kind of like powered party. It's just an advisory party. And if you look at the amount of resources that the government allocated to this council, it's just a dismal 0.157% of government expenditure that can be translated into a mere $15 per person per year. So at the district level, there's no planning, there's no capacity whatsoever to really deal with the problems that you know, this district is facing. So I think that's why, you know, I think we understand that at the neighborhood level, this is not even at the neighborhood level, this is at the district level, but we see enough problems. Say, for example, when we look at the resources, we see that, okay, the district as a whole may be okay, but that you've got this socio-spatial equity issues. It's not evenly distributed. And in terms of infrastructure, community services, because there is very little local resources and local input, so the spatial equity issues cannot really be sort of really handled. It's the same for institutional and social, you know, carrying capacity. That, you know, when we talk about, yes, at the neighborhood level or at the district level, it's so important to realize that they are so important to resolve sustainability issues. But in this particular case, as we can see, especially the old city center, it faces all these interface problems, gentrification problems, traffic congestion, overcrowding, inequity, etc. But then the local district council at the local level, they don't have the power, they don't have the resources, they don't have the expertise. So I think, you know, what our study kind of like point to the fact that we can think about many good ideas for them to become more sustainable. But until they really, you know, there is policy changes in our city, and also relocating the finances so that people at the local level who really know the problems can have, you know, the resources and also the capacity to receive, you know, to resolve, you know, their problems in a sustainable manner. So I think that's what I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mee Kam, and thank you for introducing the ideas about spatial equity to the conversation. So, and we're going to turn now to our final speaker, Luis Bettencourt. He's the inaugural director of the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation and professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Chicago. His training is in theoretical physics and his PhD is from Imperial College in London. But along the way, he found his true passion for urban science. And he's thought a good deal about how we can use science to reimagine urban systems to work in new ways that create a more sustainable and equitable world. So, Luis.
Okay. Does that look okay? Great. So thank you, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Still morning in Chicago, not as early as it is for Karen, but it's a great pleasure to also collaborate with the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. So, sorry, have a little dog. My talk will be, I'll keep on going and I hope you bear with my background noise. So my talk will be in the same spirit about the neighborhood scale. And as Karen already said, a lot of what we do is really to try to understand what cities are, how they work, to speak to the human experience on the one hand as the fundamental reason for why we have cities, but also to try to understand what cities do in human societies. And today is different to work in try to understand cities because we can look at cities throughout the world as we're doing here, but we can also look at them at different scales and across many different quantities. And so we can have a much richer systems view of what cities are and not fall into the same traps that we've fallen into in politics and planning in the past, hopefully. So, so the neighborhood scale poses an interesting conundrum because it is not really the city, right? The city works on a larger scale where many more things interact. And it's not really people, right? Because it's already a collection of people, usually over space. So we need to understand how this mesoscale actually plays its role and why it is important. So I want to start with this, right? Because we start really here to study cities as places where a lot of things change in human society. So I think a very important lens towards understanding why we care about cities, both for good reasons and bad reasons, is that they really generate dynamics, they generate change. And this change, you know, has many valences, but it's really what's been creating very fast human development across many different dimensions. It's been creating economic growth. It's been spectacular with many problems, but also many good things. And its cities are also on the cusp of our environmental impacts created related to climate change and hopefully its answers. And so we have sort of an international agenda that's very ambitious, just sustainable development goals. And the problem with this kind of approach is that we need to be able to say whose poverty, where, right? And this allows us, forces us to start having what people are calling sort of a localized approach to human development. And this brings us really to where people are and eventually to cities and neighborhoods. And that's sort of the conducting line through what I want to tell you today. So here's a plot that I use a lot in my talks and that I like, and this is about the Human Development Index. So it's a composite index of education, life expectancy, and real incomes. It comes from a very wonderful tradition of thinking about what development is. And for the purposes of this talk now, I just want to point out that you have two lines there, one that's orange and one that's blue. The blue line is for nations. So you see that some nations do better than others. Some of the ones that are doing better, like Canada, are a bit obscured. But the point is that when you look at some of the large cities in each nation, they tend to do better in human development than the nation as a whole, which means that large cities also tend to do better than smaller places. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. It's not to say that this is all we care about, but it's important as a series of things. And it's not just about economic performance, though there is a bit of that in here too. But when you look inside, so the arrows are pointing at Mumbai. And the large cities of India are considerably different and better in this measure than many of the other places in India. What you find is a picture more like that, which many of you have seen. And if you know the reality of Indian urbanization, this is typical, that there are many slums, there are many people living in very poor conditions. And so this good number, of course, once you unpack it, has a lot of heterogeneity in it and has a lot of things that we seek to make better, like have less injustice, better services, better health, and so forth. So neighborhoods become important when we do this, when we do this, sort of this mental exercise I just took you through, and when we do them everywhere, anywhere. But as we do it in different places, what we see is somewhat different as well. So I want to make the case that neighborhoods are really the scale when you look at cities where inequality is expressed and maintained. This is because of what you just saw in the picture of Mumbai, but people are sorted and sort themselves locally in cities and create places with different characters, which is good in general, but this also leads to very strong economic, racial, and other forms of segregation, including extremes like slums, but also with a wide spectrum of other dimensions. So if you want to deal with inequality, we need to deal with the composition of cities, which contain a lot of inequality, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for horrible reasons, in a place-based, disaggregated way. And we need to understand what's happening in each place and not the city as a whole. It's also the places, the previous speakers also mentioned, where social and political organization happens naturally. It, in some senses, always happened like this historically, you know, from sort of in the West, the parish, to, you know, modern life, where you may know your representative, and sort of local politics often is more effective and more vicious than sort of national politics, where we talk about abstract divisive things. But at the same time, this is often, even in places with political systems in formation or creating capacity, where that pressure comes from. and a lot of ideas even about insurgent urbanism and so forth happen at the scale of neighborhoods. And community organization always happens also at the scale of neighborhoods, even if it happens also sometimes at other scales. And finally, but most importantly, where all this comes together is that there's this idea of human capabilities. You know, how do we live in a city versus living in other environments? And in a city, we're all interdependent, right? You don't grow your own food, you don't get your own water, and so forth. You need everything through a network of services and other people. And the neighborhood is where you live, right? So it's the place where all this has to come together to sustain people, even though it doesn't express the entire system of economics and innovation and so forth that cities do. This must work for the city to work. And if it doesn't work, then everything else falls apart. So I tend to use these two theoretical frameworks that I'll just explore a little bit in data in what I follow. But since they've not been talked about, I'll just take a minute. So these are called neighborhood effects, which is more of a North American tradition, particularly with a strong footprint in Chicago. And the capabilities approach, they already sort of introduced a little bit, that has to do with this idea of human capabilities and where they're grounded. And the common thread through these, and I think something that's very important that's not quite been said explicitly yet in the previous presentations, is that we have a picture of people, humans, developing in environments. And these environments are physical, they're social, they're political, they're everything. But these environments are mostly, particularly when you're young, local in cities, and they're therefore neighborhoods. So the neighborhood effects literature really has a long history in this idea of human ecology in cities, but it's probably been developed further by Bill Wilson in the 70s and 80s in the context of sort of concentrated racial poverty in American cities, in the context of deindustrialization and so forth. And it's been a bit structural about what kind of behavioral outcomes, poverty, race, inequality come from segregation and injustice that comes in that character. Lately, we've had some developments that start to speak again to the human experience and how humans incorporate these environments and how things could be different. The capabilities approach has been less spatialized at the neighborhood scale. It's been used primarily at the national scale, even though many case studies are local. But the idea is to take this idea of a human developing capabilities and being enabled to be a creative agent and a happy and fulfilled individual in space and in social space. And this is giving us actually the first better metrics of what that development is that we can take to the neighborhood scale, but this is something new. So the thing I want to say is that studying the neighborhood, not just one neighborhood, which of course we can and we have been doing for a long time, but studying in some sense all neighborhoods and trying to make sense of their diversity and encouraging that, but at the same time, having the sense of how the system of neighborhoods, if you will, works is something relatively new, because the kind of evidence, data, evidence across scales from touching the human experience to touching, policies often on larger scales, bringing all this together is something that's very difficult to do. And it's just becoming possible through a variety of methods, both in community organization, politics, and of course, data. So this is Bill Wilson's picture of why Chicago, there's a lot of pictures of Chicago, I warn you, became poor and why in some sense, certain neighborhoods concentrated poverty and some issues related with race. And this has to do with deindustrialization and sort of hitting a certain demographic that was associated with those jobs. But what you see today is sort of a picture on the right of Chicago with certain concentrated poverty. If you know Chicago, Chicago's been used for this, not because I live here, but in the South Side and West Side. And if you look more recently, this is a much more detailed picture with better data. You still have essentially the same city that was created, 40 years ago. So even though the city was very different before in terms of growth, in terms of greater mobility, ever since the 1980s, and this is typical of many other American cities, but particularly in the Midwest, where we've been kind of stalling for a while in terms of economic change and demographics, the city's kind of been frozen in the state, even though when you look in detail, and this is very important, you'll see a lot of exceptions and a lot of neighborhoods that look a little bit different. They're more mixed economically, or they're more dynamical, and all kinds of things are happening under this pattern. So if you look at some of these other quantities that are very important, and I think this is a very important one that's gained a lot of attention, like life expectancy, you see a similar picture, that it's not just economic, but other dimensions of the human experience. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's well known that certainly in American cities, but as we look at other cities, we tend to see this too, that there may be 15, 20-year gaps in life expectancy in different neighborhoods. And this really asks questions and begs for answers that we don't have exactly, because this is health and life expectancy is an integral, so an integration of your entire living experience. And there are many things going on here. But part of what's happening, we know, has to do with what happens earlier in life rather than later, where sometimes health services are better. But one perspective that I want to always bring to your attention is this. This is the same picture about life expectancy, different colors. You can see them on top over time, is that things have been getting better, okay? So a lot of people look at these kind of maps and the problem of inequality, and they say, my gosh, we need to address this problem first. And this is true, we should address the problem of inequality. But at the same time, it happens over a moving frame where in general, on the average, things have been getting better. And this is what makes the problem actually interesting and difficult, is that on the one hand, we don't want to lose sort of these average improvements. On the other hand, we want to make them much more equitable. And this is kind of the logic that divides many people. Some people just see the average, some people just see the picture of inequality. And we need to be able to work on these two frames and bring together a picture of change in cities for good and bad things that really is disaggregated, and we can go back and forth and understand the reasons why on the aggregate or locally we're having certain outcomes. And this is what neighborhoods do for you, is that they allow you to do that. So this is South Africa, and we've done similar studies for Brazil, where we look at, for example, the delivery of services, which in these countries is relatively new. And if I show you sort of South Africa, what happens is that this is kind of complicated. In the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time, but it shows you that when you start delivering services sort of on top, so on the x-axis is the percentage of people that have access to water, sanitation, improved housing, and electricity, you tend to create more inequality because you're just starting to deliver in some populations, and these tend to go to places that are more favored. But then as you deliver more and becomes a universal service, you tend to create less inequality. So this is kind of interesting. This is not inevitable. You could deliver this more equitably. But nevertheless, this picture where you see the whole thing happening is relatively new. And so you see that in the bottom that South Africa now is achieving levels of, at least for these services, where almost everyone has it. So at least from a very basic perspective of some sustainable development goals and these basic services, there's now more equality, but there was a period in which this wasn't true. So another thing that is becoming possible, this is a new study that's not published yet, is to study this idea of the Human Development Index across scales. So I'm just showing you here sort of the picture from the nation to all the way to the neighborhood. And again, you see similar perspectives and similar outcomes, so that these theoretical frameworks can come together and provide a view of how cities transform people's lives and how people's lives transform cities. And a lot of our work is motivated by international work that has to do with issues of slums. So I'll just take you through these pictures quickly. We're just seeing the built environment for the first time, and we work a lot with local people who are measuring this and expressing their own objectives. Often they're the same objectives everywhere: having services, having dignity, having justice and safety, and creating sort of pictures of emerging cities like Lagos, projected to be the largest city in the world by the end of the century, in a way that, again, connects the human experience and human efforts all the way up to what will be a megacity. So we call this sort of approach, what we have sort of an initiative called the Million Neighborhoods, because when you put things together, and this is my last slide, effectively what you have is that there are millions of places. Each large city will probably have hundreds of neighborhoods where you would have to be working at the same time, and including with some people, but also with data, in order to make sense of this kind of change. So my point is very resonant with the previous speakers, and that there are many things, not just in terms of the challenges of our present cities, but that we have as opportunities going forward, having to do, of course, with issues of equity and equality, but also the massive investments that we're expected to make in the next few years to do with changing our energy systems, for example, and issues of pollution, and how to eradicate slums and provide services to at least 1 billion people worldwide. So again, localizing human development is critical, but not just working locally, but across scales, discovering context appropriate solutions, which you do with people, and they're not all the same, and co-producing knowledge and solutions with communities, but at the same time, understand what's fundamental and common to all people. So again, working from the local and the subjective to the larger scale where some new possibilities also exist. So it's a big challenge, but I think the neighborhood plays sort of the glue, the nexus issue in bringing all this together and making it meaningful for the human experience for the future good cities that we hope to have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis, for putting together all those wonderful thoughts. And so I really enjoyed this trip, really from Europe, from places like Freiburg and Malmo to Hong Kong, and then to Chicago. And the comparison is very powerful. While we're waiting for questions to come into the chat or for people to raise their hand, I want to just kick off with one question for you all. I think it's a hard question. So it occurs to me, sitting here again in the pandemic, that the pandemic has laid bare inequalities between neighborhoods. And some are quite sustainable indeed. It's actually proven that many of our neighborhoods, some of it that we are sitting in our privileged neighborhoods, right, have been quite sustainable through this pandemic. And others have been traps of downward mobility. So I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit on how you would help these particular neighborhoods recover.
Can I get into that?
Great.
I think you're absolutely right to point out that there is an incredible inequality in how resilient we are in times of a pandemic. But interestingly, I suppose in the 20th century, we've started to build cities very much in a similar way in Europe, in North America, and in Asia, for that matter. With the functionalist, modern sort of geometrical approach to urban development. So we're all stuck with these neighborhoods that are underprivileged, poor, not healthy, but are very spacious. So one of the chapters in the book is an in-depth analysis of one of those modernist neighborhoods where you could, I suppose, think about how to focus your effort precisely on these modernist neighborhoods, filling them in with different sort of small-scale developments that allow for these neighborhoods to become much more socially mixed. But then if you really have that as an ambition, you have to really think along with developers. Under what conditions would developers be willing to do that? Under what conditions could housing corporations be able to take on a commercial function? Because often legally they're not allowed to do that. So not limiting yourself to the morphology of these neighborhoods, but really looking into the institutional specifics that allow for these more mixed neighborhoods to emerge seems to be something that in a comparative exercise is very meaningful to do, because the solutions probably will inform the issues of the banlieue in France, of the satellite cities in Stockholm, just as much as sort of the high-rise developments in North America or indeed Hong Kong.
I think the picture's, sorry, Maarten, but I think the picture's more complicated and it's not so much to do with urban form. And in fact, I would say that at this point, and I hope the situation improves, we don't understand exactly what all the factors were that affected different parts of different cities very well. We know some. In the United, we also don't have a lot of typically good evidence. We have some, particularly in places like Sweden and so forth, they're emerging. In the United States, we have some cities that produce data by zip code, and so that's where a lot of this understanding has come from. But we see that it's not just density, it's not just economic status, it's some to do with the work that people do. And there's been a certain larger incidence, it is true, of COVID and COVID impacts and deaths in disadvantaged neighborhoods. But it's somewhat complicated. In some of the analysis we've done, the risk of a neighborhood with certain characteristics, particularly related to disadvantage and actually to low human development index, that condition increases the risk. But many of these neighborhoods did not have big outbreaks. So it's actually quite heterogeneous, and we have to be careful not to objectify that certain kinds of neighborhoods all had terrible situations and others didn't. So there are factors that have to do with people's health, such as it was before the pandemic. That had to do, for example, with density, like such as happening in Queens, New York. that had to do with the work that people do, namely they couldn't stop, they couldn't distance themselves, and they have to do also with information and trust in sort of the public information that's being created, which has been a problem to all our societies at all levels. So I think my first instinct would be, let's try to understand this better and try to see, how is it that the situation unfolded and what could be done better, because this is not over yet and won't be. But at the same time, we should be careful not to assume that we know all the answers here, I think, because I think we could do the wrong thing and just end up with an objectified picture that's not correct.
Yeah, I also agree that given our density, and also we do have a lot of neighborhoods where we do have a lot of subdivided units. People have changed, the pipes, and we actually, are very scared that we'll have a serious outbreak. But thank goodness, so far the situation has been, quite under control compared to other countries. I think our outbreak is really like today is supposed to be already not so good. It's 18 cases, today. So I think and the impacts of COVID-19 is across the board. It's not just hitting particular groups. You've got, we do have groups which are actually quite well off, and because they went to fitness center without wearing masks, and so they got this contraction, they contract COVID-19 as a result. So I also agree that perhaps we do need to have more research and data before we can actually say for sure that some neighborhoods have been, seriously hard hit than others, well, in our city at least.
Thank you. We have a question that's come in on the chat from Wendy Burton, asking about the role of green space at the neighborhood level. Is access to green space the key factor in neighborhoods that have had less COVID? Any comment?
Well, for Hong Kong, I have not really done research on it. But if we really look into like risk factors, it seems like the green spaces, well, because we don't have solid data, I really should not say that. But then I think from the current situation, it doesn't seem like you have a particularly high rate because your neighborhood has very little green spaces. I don't think we see that, not yet. Hopefully, maybe because here in Hong Kong, we're very cautious. Everyone's wearing masks and sort of like paying high attention to sanitary because of our context. If you don't do it, a serious outbreak, can knock on our door anytime. So.
That's right. I think we've seen those behavioral factors matter a lot. I want to take one last question here from John Robinson, who wants you guys to comment on the potential for urban living labs, urban transition labs, role of university in these contexts, especially think about this with the neighborhood frame.
I would say very important, but that would need the help of, like in our case, either the university will have resources, otherwise you have to rely on either the markets or the government, because the civil society is always short of resources. But in our situation, I don't think our government realized the importance of this lab. This try and error things. Our government has been pretty bureaucratic in a sense. They don't understand the importance of district level, flexibility. Everything is pretty centrally controlled. But I would say very important. The university has tried some, but university has limited resources.
Yeah, so I agree with Mee Kam. I mean, as we all said, the district or the neighborhood, that sort of scale is very important for demonstration projects. So that's good in principle. I kind of don't like the idea of labs so much because it is supposed to be an artificial situation. I think we need to seek natural situations where we start, in most cases, with existing neighborhoods and think about what sustainable path would be. And that would be sort of a positive, imaginative collaboration in different contexts between the people who live there, the city, and the university, and to imagine what that would be. But at the same time, do that with specific objectives and with funding and so forth. So that could happen. I think this is happening in lots of places, and expected in the US that with the new administration, this will be one of the things that may happen as funding comes through for science sustainable development.
From my side, perhaps two answers. On the one hand, I think in all our cases, we found that innovative forms of public participation are crucial for success. And on a second level, I suppose that there is a lot of merit in understanding how we as universities can support that, because what you also found that people have the confidence that there is a better world for them if they have access to examples where it has already happened. They can use that to mobilize politically. And I suppose sharing examples, best examples, and analyze them, why they are so good and how they could be shared, that's something that the university could contribute. So a network like ours is well positioned to fulfill precisely that function.
Yes, thank you all. And actually, you just answered the next question from Melanie on how this research and information can get to the actors who are making crucial decisions that affect the outcomes of our city. So you all have addressed that already. We're going to wrap up. The next seminar in the series is Pandemic Responses and Beyond. It will be on Monday, April 26th, 10 a.m. Eastern. For more details and to register, please go to schoolofcities.com. Thank you all for attending, and thank you so much for our speakers for joining us from around the world.